So this is our third podcast on the topic of Genesis with Dr. Willie McLeod from Core Ideas. Unfortunately, Quibus won't be joining us. He's a bit snowed under with Bible GPS teaching, but I actually really look forward to this podcast. And again, we'll be touching on Genesis, but basically looking at the fact that there's two creation stories in Genesis. We're going to be discussing what the implications of that is. And then overall, just looking at Adam and Eve. Willie and I, prior to this, to us starting the podcast, had a bit of a discussion, and we were talking about sort of the simple approach, the scientific, metaphorical, and contextual. And then we'll probably bring a couple of other items into it as well. I'm going to hand over to Willie. Welcome, and thank you for the time. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure to join you.
So Willie, my first question, we sort of touch on the fact that it looks like there's two creation stories in Genesis. Did you want to sort of elaborate on that?
Yeah, so in my view, the first story is what I would call that the creation story. That's chapter 1, verse 1, until chapter 2, verse 4. So that's, in my opinion, the creation story. It tells about the creation of the universe. Then we have another story, which directly precedes this one until the end of chapter 3. Now, this I would like to call the garden story, because it's a different story. It's about a different perspective. But what is interesting is there is some connection between the stories. For example, in the creation story, we see how God created everything from very simple things until the complex stuff, and eventually the final point of creation was the creation of the humans, of Adam. And then, but in the second story, the garden story, we again see that God creates things. But now he first creates Adam, and then he creates trees and animals from the ground. He says that he forms them from the ground. So the order is different. And that's why some scholars would see this as another creation story.
Yes.
Now, in my view, this is not what is happening here. I just think that what is happening is that the author is just, in a repetitive sense, telling that God created, for example, Adam or the trees or the animals. So when he says that God created Adam from the ground, from the soil, Adam actually also means soil, or that he has made the plants, the trees in this case actually, from the ground, and the animals. I think the focus is on the garden. So he's talking about the garden and what's in the garden. There's trees, the animals, Adam. And so the order here, I think, is not a consecutive order in the sense of the one thing was created first and then second, as we find in the creation story.
Yeah, so we can see Genesis. We can see Genesis as that linear approach to creation, whereas with Genesis 2, you move into sort of a different approach.
So in Genesis 1, because we have the consecutive days, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we have a clear process. We have progression from very simple to complex, etc., etc. So clearly the one thing follows upon the other. But in Genesis 2, it's not the same thing in the garden story. So in my view, when he says that God has made the trees, for example, from the ground, and he has made the animals, that's just in a repetitive sense, just repeating that God has done that. But it doesn't mean that God made it at that particular stage in history. So I don't think there's a historical link. There's a consecutive link. This thing was before the other. I don't think this was the intention. Or the way that the garden story should be read.
So how do you see what do you think is the intention of Genesis 2, is it to introduce you to that environment and Adam and Eve?
Yeah. So let me first say something about the word intention.
Okay.
I didn't really mention that in a serious sense. So I don't believe we would be able to find out what was the intention of the original author, which I believe to be Moses. But I do believe that some things are clear from the story. For example, what we find here is a clear metaphor.
Yes.
God as potter.
Yes.
This is not the only place in the Bible where we find it. We find it, for example, in Isaiah, later on in Isaiah. So the image of God as potter, who made Adam from the clay, who made the trees from the clay, who made the animals from the clay. So he's the potter, he makes the garden, he makes everything. The sense is not here in the same way as in Genesis 1, where there's a consecutive process of creation, where God creates from the basic to the more complex, which we've compared to the birth process, embryos, growth, and the whole cosmos coming, everything coming into existence, etc. This is not the same in this case. Here, the image is that of a potter.
Yes.
And this is actually a very old image. We find it in the ancient texts, in ancient Sumeria, in the ancient Middle East. So the author is just using an image, a metaphor, so to say. So when he says that God made Adam from clay, we should not take that literal. That's definitely not the meaning. If we do that, then he also took and he made trees from clay, he made the animals from clay, but he has already created them in the first story. So yes. It's a total conflict of understanding these things. So if one wants to take it literal in this sense, I do believe in a certain sense things should be taken literal as possible. But when a metaphor is clearly introduced in the passage, as we find in this case, we should immediately see it. So this is the metaphor of the potter, God as a potter.
And it's a beautiful metaphor.
And if we miss this, we miss the whole story. Because if we take it literal in that sense, because some people take things in my way of thinking too literal. They takes it too literal because they negate the context. They do not take the context into account. They do not take the rest of the story and all the elements of the story into account. They did not take things that's in conflict with each other because of this particular view into account. And this is exactly where one will end up. You'll end up with a story which is in conflict with the first story of creation. Yes. Because God has already created the animals and the plants. Now he's creating it again, and now he's creating it after he has created Adam. So it doesn't make sense at all. So this is not the way to read it. Yeah. We should understand this simply as an image of the potter in the way that in the Genesis 1 we've discussed it in some detail, but there we have the image of birth, the universe that comes into being, and also the image of the potter. So the image of the potter is in some sense continuously background image in this part of Genesis.
Yeah. So Willie, just you mentioned the metaphorical side of it, and you sort of, I think you hinted at an oversimplified view of Genesis. Yeah. Can you go into a bit more into the different approaches to Genesis? I mean, we've got the simple view. I think something that I find very interesting is just the scientific approach. What does that entail? Where will that lead us? And then, just looking at the contextual as well.
Yeah. So what we find with when we discuss Genesis 1, we saw there were different views. There are different views among Christians about Genesis 1, and some Christians would like to take it again, as I've just stated, in a too literal sense. So they understand the word day as a solar day. So although it is translated as day, but day, the Hebrew word yom, actually means period. Yes. It doesn't mean a solar day. So they interpret this as a solar day, 7 or 6 solar days, and then God rested. But the problem here, we've already discussed it, when one take this too literal and do not take the context into account, is that the sun was only created on the 4th day. So it's totally impossible to have day 1, 2, and 3 as solar days. And that's why we read on the 4th day that God actually on that particular day brought seasons, days, and years into being. So solar days came into being on the 4th day of creation. That's clearly stated in the text. So this is the same case that we're discussing. So if you take Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 in a too literal and simple way, you do not take the context into account, or do not take all the aspects of the story into account, then you end up with this particular view that the cosmos was created in 6 solar days. You end up with the view that God as a potter God has created Adam from soil, and he was the very first person ever created, slightly more, 6,000 years ago. And these views, although they seem biblical, in my view, does not arrive from good interpretation of the biblical text. And it's also radically against the scientific view.
Yes. So can I ask you another question? So what do you say when people refer to Adam and Eve as the original parents of the human race? How do you see that, and how would you respond to that? So the first 2 people ever created, and we all stem from that.
So again, we have exactly the same situation. If one reads the whole garden story, let's focus on the garden story. When one reads the garden story, what you'll see in the garden story is that there's a different perspective from the creation story. So what God is doing, what we're reading in the garden story, is that God made Adam here as a potter, and there was, now one would think, could have been the first person, because, here we just read, first of all, God has created Adam. But the problem, again, if we take the other aspects of the garden story into account, is that we, for example, read that Cain took a wife.
Yes.
The wife is never introduced. We have absolutely no idea where she comes from. Now, in the same way that scholars or readers that take it in a simple sense and not take the context into account, they would try to get an answer to this problem, and they would say, okay, but it was just one of Adam and Eve's children.
Yes,
this is an assumption.
Yes.
It's not what is written in the text. It's an assumption. In my view, it's wrong. Yes. But then he continues, and he says that Cain was afraid of some people outside the garden that they would kill him.
And he had to receive a mark too.
Hostile people. Yeah.
Yes.
So here we have hostile people outside the garden that would like to kill him. So obviously, here's a whole story, a background story that's not introduced by the author.
Yes. Yeah.
He just assumed there are other people outside the garden. To the biblical author, in my view, it's never a question. It's not even, I don't think he ever considered Adam to be the first human.
Yes.
So when he says that God as potter created Adam, just as a potter, it's just a metaphor. He made Adam. But that doesn't mean he was the very first person created. In fact, there's a very interesting difference between the Adam of the creation story and the Adam of the garden story. So you would like to know what is the difference between
I am fascinated.
Adam and the other Adam. You see, so there is a big difference. Now, the first thing is that Adam, the word used Adam in the creation story, that is actually just in reference to humankind.
Yes.
So it's not a reference to the person we call Adam. The word used there is just plain and simple a reference to mankind as such. And that's also why we read in this particular text, God created them male and female. And then in Genesis 5 verse 2, we find the following, and I quote from the New King James. He created them male and female, as again a reference back to the creation story, and blessed them and called them mankind. Adam.
Yes.
So Adam here means mankind. He clearly states he created them, male and female, and blessed them and called them Adam.
Yes.
So in this case, Adam is definitely not the person called Adam in the garden story, because it's clearly stated here that he called them. And that's why the New King James has translated it as mankind, called them mankind in the day they were created.
And I think that's where it's so important to look at it textually and go back to the foundational text. I just wanted to throw something else.
Let me just add this.
Yes.
So when it comes to the garden story, this person is later introduced with the name Adam.
Yes.
So here we have a particular person which is called Adam, and with him is Eve. But this is something totally different from the word Adam used in the creation story in reference to mankind. So we can interpret this as, on the sixth day of creation, the sixth period of creation, God created mankind, and that could have been long ago. According to science, at least 200,000 years ago. Yep. So God created mankind long ago, but then he introduced another story, a garden story, and he wants to tell us something else. And in this story, Adam is the person of importance. So there's a difference between Adam and mankind, and these should never be confused. Now, Adam belongs to mankind. That's why he has a play on the same word, Adam.
Yes.
Soil for mankind, or Adam, all three. But the play is, and this is also why he says that he took Adam from the soil. So there's the reason why he wants to say this is basically just to say he belongs to those discussed in the previous story called Adam, the mankind. Yes. Yeah. He's part of mankind, but he's not now physically created because it's just a metaphor.
Yes.
You can't take a metaphor too serious and think, yes, at this point in history, God created Adam out of the soil. That's just not how we should read this text, because this is not in my view, the ancient world had the same metaphor long before the Bible was written. It was a well-known metaphor, and it's also found later in the Bible. Yep. That God is a potter. That doesn't mean that if he's a potter, that was literally how he created Adam. Definitely not.
Yes. Beautiful. That makes a lot of sense. And it also puts, if you look at Schofield's gap theory, it sort of loses credibility if you look at it in that way.
Yeah, so we've discussed Schofield's view the previous time. And his gap theory, gap between Genesis 1 and 2. And I've already mentioned there's absolutely no scientific evidence for this. And he tries to, reconcile a scientific view with his interpretation of an over-literal reading of the creation story. All these problems falls away if we're just doing good interpretation. What we do is we take the text and all its parts, we discuss it together, we try and get the smaller parts to reconcile with the larger parts and the entire passage. And this is called actually the hermeneutical cycle. All the parts should correlate and there's a certain meaning arriving from the whole passage. If we just take certain parts out of context and just say, but this is this, it's not that, it's not correct. One can't do that. That's not good hermeneutics. Good hermeneutics is to understand why the sun was created on the fourth day and give a good reason and explanation for that.
Yeah.
And the same with Adam. To explain why Adam was made first and then the trees and then the animals, I mean, it's in direct conflict with the creation story. So all these things become massive problems that these readers often do not recognize because they do not carefully engage with the text.
Yeah. So Willie, my little curveball now is if you look at the scientific perspective and you look at reasons to believe, they sort of refer to Adam and Eve. Can you sort of expand on, just give me your opinion on that?
Yeah, so they have a different view altogether. So what they do is they would say that Adam and Eve actually should be read in scientific terms. So what they say is Adam and Eve go back to a primeval pair, Adam and Eve. Mitochondrial Eve and the Y chromosomal Adam. Yeah. So they see Adam and Eve as the primeval pair from which all humans were descended. And, studies have shown that such a pair in history should be placed about, let's say, 150 to 200,000 years ago. So what they would say is Adam and Eve in this garden story. So again, they mixes the creation story and the garden story.
Oh, yeah.
So what they say is in the garden story, Adam and Eve, they equate Adam with mankind. Adam, the word Adam. So they equate the name Adam with the word Adam, meaning mankind. So they do it in the opposite direction. Yes. The one group takes mankind and equates it with Adam, and out of the opinion that the cosmos is just 6,000 years ago and that Adam was the first person ever created, and that was out of soil. The other group do the same thing in the opposite direction. So what they do, they equate Adam with the Adam, which means mankind in Genesis 1. And then they say that Adam and Eve was the primeval pair about 200,000 years ago. Now, in my opinion, this is problematic because there is absolutely no doubt that the biblical author introduces Adam and Eve in the framework of the historical horizon of biblical tradition. So there's a long tradition going back in the ancient Middle East, but there's a certain horizon in the rememberable history. And there's a reason for this, because Adam is not that unique. Many people which only reads the Bible do not even know that the biblical version is not the only version available in the Middle East about this particular person. We also find reference to him in Sumerian tradition where he is called Adapa. Similar names. But in the case of Adapa, we have a very similar story. He's also misled by a god called Enki, which is sometimes envisioned as a serpent in the same way that Eve is misled, and both are misled regarding certain fruit of life. Both has a certain relation with the Most High God and is misled in terms of the fruit associated with a visit in the presence of this God in the Bible. It's in the garden story that we find this story. But the point of the matter is that Adapa is never presented as the first human. He is the prototypical woman, a man.
Yes.
In the same sense that Adam is definitely also prototypical. But he is actually the first civilizer. He's the one that brought civilization to Sumer and to the ancient Middle East. So the people of the ancient Middle East, remember, the author of the Bible stood in a context, a wider Middle Eastern context. He knew about Adapa. There's absolutely no doubt that he didn't know about the Sumerian version of the story that he is telling. He didn't take it from the Sumerians, I believe. No. This tradition was independently handed down in Abrahamic circles for a long time, and the base material was used by this author, which I believe to be Moses. We've discussed it previously why I believe so, and in one of the other episodes we'll come back to that. Yeah. But what is extremely important is there's a wider context. There's a world outside the Bible. Yeah. And the biblical author knew about it, and he knew about Adapa. So although he doesn't borrow from Sumerian tradition, he has his own tradition. It's in two different traditions that this ancient figure are remembered. The one is Adapa in the Sumerian tradition, and the other is Adam in the biblical tradition. So that's why for the biblical author, there's not a question that there are other people outside the garden.
Yes. So when I look at Adam and Eve, would you say that they physically existed? And especially if you look at those traditions, and do you think those traditions, Sumerian and Abrahamic, come together at some point?
Yeah, I think I remember a certain historical person. I think there's good reason to think so.
Because it does impact things like Genesis 6, for instance, if you were to go down.
Yeah, we'll come to that. Yeah. So that's why, within the biblical framework, he's the fourth father within remembered history of the Israelites. This most distant fourth father. He's the first remembered person. Why is he important from the biblical perspective? One should ask that question.
I think
you see, people have it wrong in the sense that they think that he is important because he was the first human. He's not important because he was the first human. He's important because he was the first human that we know of with whom God had a relationship. The Bible is about God's relationship with mankind. This is what the Bible is about. Yes. This is a story told in the Bible. So Adapa in the Sumerian story had a relation with the Most High God. It's the same in the biblical story. Adam has a relation with God.
So he had a relation. So, sorry for interrupting, but I think we sort of overly focus on the creation of Adam and Adam and Eve and forget that it's about a relationship with God, and that's where the fall comes in, is that breaking of the relationship.
Yeah, so I think once you understand that the reason why Adam is important from a biblical perspective is not because he was the first human ever created. A good reading of the garden story tells us he was not the first human. This is a metaphor, but he's important because he's the first one in remembered history with whom God had a relationship. There might have been other persons earlier with whom God had a relationship, but that we do not know their stories. He's the first one, and we'll talk about the fall also. That's very important at a later point. That also enters our story. But maybe let me come back to Eve.
Yes.
Now, the interesting thing about Eve is that she was created from Adam's rib. And the question is, how should we take this? Now, the same problem arrives here, which we've already talked about regarding Adam being made from the soil. In that case, it's a metaphor of God as a potter. In this case, it's also a well-known story from the ancient Middle East that the author has made use of. So we know the story. It's an extra biblical story. It's told since part of Sumerian history again. In this story, there was a certain god. His name, I've already introduced him. His name is Enki. And 8 gods were formed from his body. And because they formed from his body, they're very closely related to him as himself. But among them, now what in the Sumerian text, what we find is they refer to a certain body part, but then we have a play on words, and we have another name that's introduced. Now, the one is Lady Rib. Okay. She was made from his rib. Now, one could say, okay, this is just a coincidence. Here we have Lady Rip made from this god's rib, and here we have Eve made from Adam's rib. But then there's the next point. The play that we find in the Sumerian is between Rib and life. So Lady Rib is also Lady Life.
Yes.
Now in Genesis we read that Eve was made from Adam's rib, and she was called Life. There cannot be any doubt that the author took this image from a well-known story in the ancient Middle East. And he had a reason to do this, because he just wanted to express the closeness between Adam and Eve. So Eve and Adam both are extremely important in his story, because they're the primeval pair, the most distant and remembered forefather and mother of the Israelites. And they're both important. But Eve is not made from Adam's rib in a literal sense. The author couldn't, he knows the story, he obviously uses the story, and he reworks the story for his story. We often find a literary motive that we often use is we take another story, we rework it, and we write our own story. And this is exactly what he does at this early stage already. He takes another story, he reworks this particular motive, and he introduces it in his story to explain and show how closely connected Adam and Eve are to each other. And he has already done that in a certain sense in chapter 1, when he said God created mankind, man and female, male and female, created them. Yeah.
Nowadays, you'll get into trouble for saying that, eh? Absolutely. Anything else on the scientific view you'd like to lift out?
Yeah, so I just think that one should not mix the creation story and the garden story.
Yeah.
The creation story tells how God created everything in 6 periods of creation, which could have been over a very long time period, and in my view is not in conflict with science. The biblical author doesn't have a scientific perspective, obviously. He doesn't write from a scientific perspective, but what is extremely important, it's definitely not solar days. It's longer periods, the sun only having been created on the 4th day. That's why it's so nicely compatible with the scientific view. We've discussed that the previous time. On the other hand, we have the garden story. The garden story is a different story. The same metaphor that we found in the first story of God as a potter is again introduced, but this time in a different way and sense. And we are told how Adam is made from soil, in the same sense that God said he made Israel from soil at a later stage in Isaiah, which nobody takes serious in that case, but here they like to take it too serious. So it's just a metaphor introducing the fact that Adam, the person with the name Adam, is the same, or of the same gene, if we can say it in this way, as Adam, meaning mankind. And in this story, we have metaphors, especially the one of God as a potter, but also what the author introduces is this metaphor of the closeness between Adam and Eve, of her having been taken from his rib. So we don't have to worry whether Adam has one less rib than before. It's not meant literal. We know this because this story is very well known, and the author would definitely have known the story. He has actually taken. If it was not for her name meaning life, it could have been there could have been some discussion, but there can be no discussion. It's absolutely clear.
Yeah. So Willie, and now I just want to take it one step further, and I know there's going to be a lot of discussion around this, but so now I take Adam and Eve and I place them into the context of the garden. So I assume the garden would be a physical environment within the greater creation. And
Yeah,
that would
so
probably be the place where that interaction between Adam, Eve, and God took place.
yeah, so again, the biblical story is not unique. So in the Bible, we read that the garden was in the east. In Genesis, we read this in the garden story. It was located in the east, and it was located at the headwaters, in the region of the headwaters, the head, it's clearly stated there, of the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, which means it was situated somewhere in northwestern Iran or somewhere in that geographical area, towards the east.
Yes,
that's what.
And you've got the four rivers, the Pishon and the Havilah.
Exactly, and the other two rivers, we can also clearly find them in history and geographically, but we can discuss that the next time. But what is important here is that this garden is located in the east. This is one of the reasons. There are many reasons why I believe we can show that Genesis is very old, and the material incorporated in Genesis is very old. Because we find during the period of the Exodus, we also read about the Garden of Eden. It's called Eden, it's called the garden. But now it's definitely not in the east, it's in the Lebanon. The location has changed. So in this case, it's not the historical garden that is being referred to. It's just the Lebanon is taken as a type. And he actually also in this case gets it from the story of Gilgamesh. Where we read about the council of the gods and the mountain of the gods. And what is interesting in Ezekiel, where he makes this reference, it can be translated as the mountain of the gods, not mountain of God. It's usually translated that. But in my Bible, in the Afrikaans Bible that I sometimes read, we find the mountain of the gods.
Because there is the view that Eden was on top of God's mountain. Now, that might be metaphorical as well, but
yeah. So this is again taken from outside the Bible, from the Gilgamesh epic. It's a long story, but anyhow, the point of the matter is, during the exile period, the exilic period, this garden was located in the Lebanon, and long before that, in actual fact, the Gilgamesh epoch dates back to the early old Babylonian period. That's about, let's say, 1800 BC. That's about the time of Abraham. So from that time, and even slightly earlier, this garden was placed in the Lebanon. But before that, there's an even older tradition in which this garden was not placed in the Lebanon. It was placed in the north, in Arata. And that's fascinating, because Arata is most probably where the name Urartu originated in geographical terms, and the biblical Ararat originated. Now that's to the north, and from Israel is towards the east. And there was an ancient tradition in ancient Sumer about such a mountain, a primeval mountain in the north from Sumer, which clearly agreed with the biblical description, geographical description. So this is an extremely old tradition that we find in the Bible about this particular mountain. And the Bible places Adam and Eve on this mountain. So there, I believe this was probably a certain kind of sanctuary. And there was this garden, because quite often we find the garden on top of the mountain of the gods being a certain location in this case, because in Genesis 2, in the garden story, God is very involved there. He walks in the garden. So there's good reason to believe that the mountain of God was close by. And in Ezekiel, we find that the garden is on the mountain of God, or the gods. And this is an ancient concept, that the garden is actually on the mountain of the gods.
Yeah, and Arata features in Lugolbanda and in Merkar.
So that's the stories. Yeah, that's from the Earth 3 period. That was about before 2000 BC. So that's old. That's the older material. So it was an older perspective.
Yes.
And that older perspective is the one that we find in Genesis, in the garden story. The lighter perspective, since the old Babylonian period, is the one that we find in the prophet Ezekiel. And it's totally different.
Yes.
And if you don't know these things, you can totally misunderstand what is going on. So what we clearly find is that there was an old tradition about a mountain of God somewhere in the north, from Israel towards the east in the area of the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Yes.
Now, from the biblical perspective, this is where Adam and Eve is located. The primeval pair in the sense that they are the model. They are the model. So what Moses, in my view, wrote this. We can discuss again another time why I'm saying this. I've already given some reasons. I've got many other reasons. So what he has written the creation story because, as we read in chapter 2, verse 2 and 3, God, if he created in 6 periods and rested on the 7th period, Israel should also work 6 days and rest on the 7th. So that's the model for Israel. So the reason why the creation story is ordered this way is to serve as a model. God did it this way, that's why Israel should do it this way. The same for Adam and Eve. God did it in this way. He created Adam and Eve. They're the model. And this is why, if this is God's model, we should follow God's model. And this introduces the concept of marriage. So I think it's quite clear that the rib episode is not to be taken literal. The creation of Adam from the soil is not to be taken literal. These are metaphors. There can be absolutely no doubt that they are metaphors. And once we understand this, then we can place the garden story somewhere in history. We can, as Christians, believe in a historical Adam and Eve. It's totally impossible to show that they have ever lived. This is totally beyond the possibility of science. So this will always be an issue of belief. We can never, ever, it's not only before the first writing was introduced and the first literature in about 2500 BC. It's long before that. There's just no way that we can show this. But Christians can believe it. There's no reason not to believe it, especially since we find it also in another story in Sumer, the story of Adapa. Yeah. Now, since the biblical author introduced the story from Sumer, which he reworked, the one about Enki and the rib. Yeah. There's absolutely no reason why the Adam and Eve story is not in the same sense. So he also might have reworked the story of Adam or Adapa in a certain way because he has a certain message to convey about Adam and Eve. So this story is also a moral of the story.
Yes, I wanted to ask about that.
Yeah, so we can believe in a historical Adam and Eve, but at the same time, we can also see that the author is here producing a model. He is in the same way in Genesis 1, is a model, it's God's model. Again, we have God's model for humankind.
Yes, absolutely. So before we end up with this podcast, what's the take-home message for Christians? You sort of alluded to a couple of things. I mean, it's a model for marriage and relationship. It's relationship with God. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating part of the Bible, chapter 1 to 3. And I think once one makes this distinction, distinction between the creation story and the garden story. One handles them apart. The one is about the creation of mankind, the other is the garden story about Adam and Eve. Then there's absolutely no conflict with science. It's good hermeneutics because all aspects of the story are reconciled and are incorporated in the story, are explained in a very sensible way. which is the basics of good hermeneutics. You don't have issues and problems to explain this or that because you take it too literal. You should take it literal in a certain sense, but it should be in the context. You shouldn't do something that's beyond the context because then it's a wrong reading. The context is extremely important. So it's good hermeneutics that we've engaged with in explaining and trying to understand chapters 1 to 3, but it also tells us that the biblical story is not in conflict with science. So often, because Christians hold to a simple view, a view which is not taking all these aspects of the story into account, as a very basic and simple, must I say, understanding of the text. They do not engage in any sense in good hermeneutics. They do not take the ancient world from which the Bible originated into account. They do not know anything about that. So now they take their view as the standard in conflict with science, and they say science is wrong, we are right. They are not right because the Bible does not say this. Often we read the Bible say this or the Bible say this. The Bible definitely doesn't say these things. It's their wrong interpretation of the Bible. So when we interpret this in a good and solid way, it's not in conflict with science. And I think this is an extremely important point to make.
Beautiful, absolutely. And Cobus will sort of point to the pastoral part of that as well. Yeah. And at the end of the day, it also addresses relationship. The fact that God created us to have a relationship with Him. That relationship was broken, but also if you look at Adam and Eve, we want to be in a relationship with people, but it's that striving towards that sort of renewing that relationship with God.
Yeah, so this story is where the relationship of God with mankind commenced. It might have commenced earlier, but in remembered history, this is where it commenced. And it's extremely important because we also discussed the fall at the later stage.
Yes.
But that also involves the relationship with God. That's center. In the garden, God, Adam and Eve, their relationship.
Beautiful. Thank you, Willie. This has been really fascinating, and I think you've clarified a lot for myself and definitely for people that will listen to this podcast. And along with those lines, I just want to say this is a joint podcast between Core Ideas and the Bible GPS. And I'm going to post all of the links on the YouTube channel as well as the podcast. Please click, please like, please share. We would really appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Willie. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.